Hello and welcome to this webinar by Timber Exchange on the American grading system. Let's wait a few moments until more people come in and we will start. But in the meantime, you can actually write in the chat where in the world you are watching from. It's usually quite fun to ask because we get literally people from all across the world that care about the different topics that we cover regularly. We have Sweden, Italy, Latvia, Finland, Greece even, Russia, Austria, Germany, wow, Japan. Super interesting. And nice to see so many fellow friends and faces and new friends as well, of course. Let's wait one more minute to let the last people come in and then we will start. Okay, it seems pretty stable now, around 75 participants. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to this webinar by Timber Exchange, the ecosystem for the global forestry industry. And in this webinar, we will discuss the American grading system with the renowned Timber Products Inspection. Our honored guests today are the extremely knowledgeable David Connor, Senior Vice President of Operations with a 25-year career in TPI. And our second guest is Mr. Robin Lillandt, Senior European Representative with a 20-year career in TPI. Truly two experts. And I'm very glad to see such a large turnout today. And very briefly, before we get started, I'd like to also introduce myself. My name is Amir Rashad, and I come from a family with over 50 years of industry experience in the forestry industry. And I have myself been a timber trader for a decade. But today I lead Center Source Technologies, which is the creator of Timber Exchange, which some of you might have heard of. And our company is a Swedish technology company with 32 staff, offering a supply chain management platform, but also a B2B marketplace and a market data hub. And the companies today on our platform combined produce, transport, or purchase almost 30 million cubic meters annually. And we created this because we saw a lot of blind spots and efficiencies in existing ERPs and how companies work today. But now let's get into the hot topic of the day, the American grading system. Welcome, David and Robin.
Thank you, Amir. You're very kind.
Thank you.
David, my first question is to you. Can you please tell us more about TPI and your work?
Certainly, happy to. So before we get started, thanks for having us today. I would like to start off with just a quick antitrust statement. Very common for U.S. Meetings to have these, so we should avoid any discussions that could result in restraint of trade, monopolization, price fixing, or basically any other type of unfair market controlling conditions. So we'll make sure that we stay away from that today. So I'll start off a little bit about TP. We started in 1969 as a private for-profit inspection agency. We're currently over 120 employees. We're located primarily in the US, but we have representatives in Europe and South America. We have over 3,500 subscribers that we're visiting on a monthly or quarterly basis, depending on the program, sometimes annual basis. But for the lumber division that we're talking about today, primarily, we have over 50 subscribers in Europe. We're providing ALSC inspections for the US. We also do JAS inspections. But we do a lot more than just lumber. Amir, we're in panels. We inspect preservative treatment. We inspect heat treatment for ISPM 15 wood packaging. We inspect trusses, utility poles, biomass, basically any type of wood product that requires some type of third-party auditing. That's essentially our footprint. We have a very large testing facility in the Atlanta area. Our headquarters are located in Atlanta. We have a corporate headquarters in Peachtree City, Georgia. And then Conyers, Georgia is the location of that testing lab. That's just a little bit about TP and who we are.
Super interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And I'd like to jump right into it. So we hear a lot about the American Lumber Standard Committee.
Mm-hmm.
So what is that and what led to its creation?
Sure. So ALSC, the American Lumber Standard Committee, it's a nonprofit organization, first of all. It's made up of manufacturers, distributors, users of lumber, and consumers of lumber. And those members are appointed by the U.S. Department of Commerce. So that's why it's typically referred to. A lot of people think of it as the government, but it's a quasi-government nonprofit organization. TP is a member of the American Lumber Standard Committee. So it serves as it's one of its primary reasons for being is to serve as the standing committee for the American Softwood Lumber Standard, also known as the PS20. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But some of the other things that ALSC does, they administer an accreditation program for this grade marking of lumber produced under the overall ALS system. The ALSC committee elects the board of review. This is a 3-member board of review. And the board of review is an autonomous body that's responsible for serving as the certification and accreditation board for ALSC. So for instance, Timber Products, we're an accredited grading agency and we're accredited by the Board of Review for the American Lumber Standard Committee. The ALSC system, it also provides for the acceptance of lumber and design values for lumber by the building codes throughout the US. And we'll get into that, I'm sure, a little bit later too. But I mentioned the American Softwood Lumber Standard. So that's also called the Voluntary Product Standard 20, or the PS20, is what a lot of people refer to that as. The efforts to standardize lumber in the US began in 1922. The first version of that American Softwood Lumber Standard was actually published in 1924. And it is maintained by the American Lumber Standard Committee. That's how everything ties together. Some of the things that the PS20 accomplishes is it establishes the sizes. So the fact that a 2x4 dressed and dry is actually supposed to be 1.5 inches by 3.5 inches as a minimum size. That is established in the PS20. It establishes green and dry relationships. So as moisture changes, you're going to expect sizes to change. That's established in the PS20. The method for assigning design values comes from the PS20, along with industry nomenclature. It defines the terms that we use, inspection and reinspection provisions, and even grade marking requirements. So this provides the basis for the policies and procedures developed by ALSC, and it's enforced through the ALSC's Board of Review. Finally, it's published, the PS20 is published by the National Institute for Standards and Technology, or NIST, if you've heard of that. And that also operates under the US Department of Commerce. So there's a lot of touchstones that come back to federal oversight through the US Department of Commerce. The reason that it started in 1922 is that there was no standardization for the sizes of 2x4 in the US prior to this. There was no standardization for what is a number 2. So the federal government basically went to the lumber industry and said, look, you guys either need to regulate yourselves or we're going to come in and regulate it for you. So back in the 1920s, that's when ALSC really got started, because it was a group of lumber manufacturers that got together that decided, all right, we need to get our acting in gear and get this homogenized throughout the US. So that's how ALSC got started and why it got started.
Super interesting. So with that said, how does the market actually need lumber to conform to building standards?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So why even have grade rules, right? So you need grade rules out there because the designers and the engineers, they need to know how a building substrate will perform. You know, if you think about things other than wood, like steel and concrete, it's just like wood in the fact that you've got to know what to expect from that piece of wood to know how you can properly design with it. The grades are what tell the consumer and that designer and that engineer how the product should be expected to perform, basically. So with those different grades, you're going to have different strengths, you're going to have different qualities, and that's when the building codes come in. We've got the International Building Code in the US, also that's called the IBC. We also have the IRC, the International Residential Code, that specifically provides guidance about our residential structures. And those building codes tell the local building code officials that enforce these building codes to look for grade stamps from agencies such as Timber Products that are accredited by the American Lumber Standard Committee's Board of Review. The building codes are interesting in the US, but in most of the US, because they provide for prescriptive usage. So that's how the average Joe out there can know that he can go take a stud in typical areas that don't have high wind zones or things like that. And he can build that wall 16 inches on center with his studs. He can go up to a certain height. And he doesn't necessarily have to have that particular basic type of framing approved by an engineer. When you get outside of that, if you get into these high wind zones, or if you get into areas that have a lot of seismic activity with earthquakes and things of that nature, or if you get into areas with really high snow loads, where roofs have to have certain designs, then sometimes you have to get into engineered plans as well. Or if it's has specific designs that are a little more creative, then you may have to get into engineered as well. But a lot of the building that takes place in the US can typically be accomplished using grade stamp lumber under the prescriptive building codes. So that's why you'd want to have grade rules and how they interact with the building codes.
I see, but how are the grading rules also created and published?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the national grade rule. So we talked about ALSC wanting to, back in the day, come up with a consistent method for everybody in the United States, no matter where you are or no matter what species you're using. And actually, no matter where that species or that actual wood was grown, they wanted to make sure that there was a standardized method for this. So the ALSC, that committee, approves bylaws that allow for the commission of the National Grade Rule Committee. TP is a voting member of the National Grade Rule Committee. The National Grade Rule Committee publishes and approves and modifies from time to time the National Grade Rule. And you'll hear us talk about that, and we call it the NGR, okay? And the National Grade Rule applies to dimension lumber. Dimension lumber, for what most of the people on this webinar today would consider, is going to be your 2-inch thick material. It's actually 2 through 4 inch thick, but your 2x4, your 2x6, your 2x8, those rules that we're using every day when we go into sawmills stem from this National Grade Rule. And the National Grade Rule, once that's adopted and approved, it gets published by rules writing organizations. They may have to make some small changes based on things like decay, where different species will experience different types of decay. So you'll see some minor modifications based on local requirements like that. But the national grade rule is the reason why when you look at any of the dimension grades in the US, no matter what the species, which are published under several different agencies' rules, you're going to find that the 2x4 or number 2 edge knot is the exact same in all those rules. You're going to find that the wane allowance on that number 2 2x4 is the exact same in all those rules. It's because it's based on the national grade rule. So those are where those decisions are made as to what is a number 2 2x4. And then it gets adopted by the rules writing agencies for dimension lumber. So talked a little bit about what they're based on, but how do we get those rules and how do we get the design values that go along with those rules? So the design values, at least for dimension lumber, are generated using an ASTM standard. It's ASTM D1990 for dimension lumber. And here's what it requires. It's going to be species specific, and it's going to be region or growth region specific. Now, in the US, Southern yellow pine, for instance, is approved for basically the entire US because it grows in one general area. And when those design values were established, samples were taken from that entire area. So we know that if it came from the US, if it's Southern yellow pine, we know what those design values are. In Europe, it works the same way, but it ends up with, it seems like it's a little bit different. And the reason it works a little different is because each country or each region, if it's not an entire country, was tested for those specific design values. And to do that, the ASTM standard requires you to get 6 different grade cell combinations. So you get 3 different widths from each cell. You get them from 2x4s, 2x8s, and 2x10s, generally speaking. You can modify this a little bit sometimes if there's already a similar species approved or a similar region. But you have to get 2 grades from each of those widths from each of those cells. So you have to pull select structural and a number 2. So you're getting a really high grade, and then number 2, which is a little bit of a lesser grade. Each one of those cells requires you to get 360 pieces from a representative portion of whatever region you're getting approved, whether it's a country, whether it's a specific state within a country, or whether it's a region, such as in the US, where it's the entire growing region of Southern yellow pine. You then have to do 3 tests on each one of those cells. You got to do bending, you have to do tension and compression testing on those. So at the end of the day, you're doing 8,640 specimen tests to generate the design values for whatever region and species you're studying. Once you've done all that, you take all those test results and you boil them down to one 2x8 common value. Then the sizes are extrapolated back out to a 2x4 and back up to a 2x12. And then the grades are extrapolated to get select structural to number 1, and the number 2 gives you the number 3. So it's all mathematically controlled. But it's quite an exhaustive process to go through. And anybody on this call that has ever gone through this can tell you this thing, it's a very expensive process to go through, and it's a very exhaustive process. It easily, to start to finish, can take a good 1.5 years to come up with design values. Let's see, these, I mentioned they're region and species specific. And then once you have these, what the ASTM standard will give you is all of your different design values. So those design values are your bending, your extreme fiber and bending. That's your F sub B, F is in Frank. It gives you your tension parallel to grain. That's F sub T. It gives you your horizontal shear, and that's F sub V, as in Victor. It gives you both of your compressions, your perpendicular to grain and your parallel to grain. And then it also gives you the modulus of elasticity, which is the stiffness of that wood fiber. So I know I probably went into more detail than you wanted to know, but I wanted to explain for people so they understood exactly how exhaustive it is to do this. Every species that has approved design values had to get them approved and recognized by the American Lumber Standard Committee. So the ALSC will receive the submission for those design values. They will review those. They typically pass them along to our Forest Products Laboratory, Madison, Wisconsin, where we have experts there that will look at the procedures that were used, the math behind it, and generally give a technical recommendation to the American Lumber Standard Committee. And then once the ALSC is happy with that and they're satisfied with it, it gets voted on and gets accepted. You can actually see a comprehensive list of all of the approved design values of the international design values hosted on American Lumber Standard Committee's website, alsc.org. So that's a little bit about how the grade rules are created and how those design values get published.
That's super interesting, and thanks for sharing such an in-depth answer. And that's, also why I think so many people are here today. Maybe even those that already have stamps or certifications and those that want to get certified. Mm-hmm. Because I know some mills personally that have wanted to get certified, but they've stopped at the design value stage. And probably because of this reason, because it's such a long progress. And especially if you deal with maybe a short-term perspective that just want to catch the US market whilst it's hot, but who knows what it will be like in 1.5 years' time when you get certified.
That's right.
So of course, it'll be very, very different. And as I understand from companies that export a lot to the US, you need to have a very long-term perspective when you enter that market. Don't try to catch the top or the bottom, because in the end, it will average out quite nicely.
One more interesting thing while we're talking about design value approvals, there are some design values that are approved out there that we can't access today. And the reason we can't access those are because they are in areas of political unrest that ALSC has told us and given us the guidance that said, look, we can't go in there to monitor this. Therefore, you can't use those design values for all intents and purposes. And the two that come to mind today are, there's an area called the Archangel region in Russia that has design values. And there are design values for some species in Ukraine where we're no longer going into either, or we won't go into either of those because ALSC is not going into those. So if somebody were to call me today with a new mill in Ukraine and say, hey, I'd like to get design values, I have to tell them, look, I'm not allowed to go in there per ALSC, so we can't work with you. So thought that was an interesting thing.
David, for anyone that wants to review how the US market is performing, they usually read the random lengths, but it's just pages and pages of products. There are so many different ones. And there's even tables, multiple tables for just 2x4s. So I'd like to ask you, some products might seem similar, but actually they're not. So what is, for example, the difference between a number 2 grade and a stud grade?
Good question. So when you have the visual grades in the national grade rule, in that NGR, all right, your grades are select structural, that's the highest grade. Then you have number 1, number 2, number 3. You'll hear a lot of people also refer to number 4. Of course, there is no published number 4. It's just anything that won't go to number 3. You also have the densities that can be added to this. So for select structural, you might also see somebody refer to dense select structural, or DSS. So that adds an additional restriction on that material. It requires a denser product, so it's going to be considered a higher grade. So that's how they fall in line. There is also a grade that's not published in the NGR, but it is a published and accepted grade of prime. There's 1 prime and 2 prime. So when you look at number 2 versus a number 2 prime, we'll talk about that first. The difference there, there's 3 primary differences. You've got wane, skip, and whole. So a number 2 prime has all the strength characteristics of a number 2. So your slope of grain, your knots, your decay allowances, things that can affect the structural application of that piece. The exact same from a number 2 to a 2 prime. But the visual appearance of that. So your wane is much more restricted in a number 2 prime. It's a lot of folks will refer to it as a pencil wane, where it can only be 1/4 of an inch, and a pencil is approximately 1/4 of an inch. You can also only have a pencil-sized hole in number 2 prime, which is basically, again, a 1/4 inch hole, about the size of a pencil. And then the skip is more restrictive in number 2 prime, or the rough finish is more restrictive. So that's a little bit about the differences between number 2 and 2 prime. The difference between number 2 and stud's an interesting animal, because basically on a stud, when you build a wall with a 2x4, for instance, one of the most important characteristics of that piece to the builder, the person that's actually putting it in place, is the edge of that 2x4, not so much the wide face, because the edge is what he's going to have to nail his sheathing to on the outside, or his drywall, his sheetrock on the inside. So basically, when they came up with a stud grade, which is part of the NGR, they looked at it like a number 1 edge with a number 3 wide face. So you have a lot more restriction on the narrow face to give a prettier edge, but the wide face can still basically be a number 3 with strength characteristics of a number 3 as well. So that's a little bit about the differences between some of the typical grades you might see in the pricing guides.
And David, does the US market accept and use both machine stress rated lumber and visually graded, or primarily one of them?
Yes, that's a good question. So the primary production from our subscriber mills, we have close to 300 subscriber mills total in our lumber program, by the way. The vast majority of them are producing visually graded lumber day in, day out. And that's true for most of the US lumber manufacturers out there. You do have some mills that specialize in MSR lumber, and MSR, by the way, stands for machine stress rated lumber. And basically what MSR lumber means is it does have some visual requirements and some visual overrides that most of the time equate it to a number 2 wane, number 2 skip, things of that nature. But from a structural standpoint, you're going to use some type of mechanical device to test every single piece of production as it goes through. In the older days, back in the early 2000s and in the late 1900s, there were machines that would literally flex the piece as the board went through in a lineal fashion, and it would measure how much deflection it required, or how much force it required to produce a known deflection. And some of those are still working today, and they work just fine. Nowadays, a lot of the sawmills have gone to a thumper style, which basically pings the end of every single board, and then it has a microphone that listens to that sonic wave as it travels through the piece. And essentially, the faster it travels through the piece, the cleaner that wood fiber is, and the easier it can travel through. And there's a correlation that shows with pretty good accuracy that's going to be a stronger piece. So you have to do that on day-to-day production for MSR. Every single piece gets tested in that some form or fashion. You also then, and this is where it becomes a little more labor intensive to produce MSR, you also have to pull off samples and take them over to your test bench and physically stress those pieces and put it under a load to confirm that the correlation is still accurate and that the machine, your production machine, is properly selecting the candidate stock. So it requires more work to produce MSR. It requires additional testing. It requires the additional machinery to do so. So that's why I would say most mills don't produce MSR, but those that do usually are larger mills that are producing higher production. If I had to take a ballpark guess, I would say that I'd say less than 10% of all the production that comes into the US and stamped under the ALSC program is going to be MSR. That's a guess, but it's probably pretty close, probably closer to 5%.
And on the topic of lumber coming into the US, so let's say I am exporting or interested to export. Now I understand how to get certified and also what it's used for, but is there anything else I should be aware of? For example, like administration or compliance, maybe phytosanitary certificates or certificates of origin or Euro 1s.
Well, phytosanitation, absolutely. Phytosanitation has been a hot topic. And I will say that a disclaimer that, the grading agency is not involved with the phytosanitation when it comes to the US imports. And I know that seems kind of strange because we're monitoring your dry kilns when we go into a sawmill. We issue grade stamps that actually say KD for those that use dry kilns. And we issue grade stamps that say HT for heat treatment for those mills that can properly heat treat lumber. But this is under the ALSC system when TP is doing this. And what that means is the whole purpose for the ALSC grade stamps is so that it can be recognized for use in the United States. Okay, that's the primary reason that it exists. And ALSC's definition of HT is that it has been heat treated to a minimum of 56 degrees centigrade at the core for a minimum contiguous 30 minutes. Okay, well, the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, they require importation of lumber completely outside the ballpark of ALSC's oversight and purview. They require importation of lumber to be done through import permits. And there are three primary methods that you can use heat to phytosanitize lumber that is recognized by the USDA. And I'll read these three sentences out in a second, but this is also enforced by the US Customs and Border Protection there at the ports. So again, not enforced by ALSC, not enforced by the grading agencies or TP, and not overseen by ALSC or the grading agencies. So I thought that was an important thing to clarify before we get into this. The three methods that the USDA recognizes, though, are that you can either heat treat the lumber to 71.1 centigrade as opposed to 56 centigrade. And this is for commodity lumber. This is not for wood packaging material. Let's make sure that we understand that too. So 2x4, 10-foot number 2, for example. It had to have hit 71.1 centigrade at the core for a minimum of 75 minutes or more, okay? That's the first way. The second way is the exact same thing, 71.1 at the core, 75 minutes, and you're making a declaration that moisture content is below 20%. Don't ask me why they've got both of those. The first one seems a bit redundant, but you can either say it with or without the moisture content reduction. The third way is to be able to accurately make the statement that you kiln dried that lumber under a treatment as prescribed in the dry kiln operator's manual. That system is a bit antiquated because my understanding of the dry kiln operator's manual is that it was designed as a way for the USDA to provide guidance to sawmills that didn't have a good handle on how to operate the dry kilns. It was a best practice for how to operate your dry kilns. It gives suggested schedules. And since the USDA recognizes that document, they also recognize that if you're using that, that's good enough for them to say, okay, we trust that this has been heat treated properly. I referenced that it's a bit antiquated because I think that was invented before the concept of true definition of heat treatment was established. Because the USDA also allows for WPM to come in under the guidance of ISPM 15, and that only requires 56 centigrade at the core for 30 minutes. That's also why ALSC uses 56 centigrade at the core for 30 minutes. So I'm hearing stories here recently. This is over just the last few months from folks that have been bringing in lumber for years, for decades, and they have been using statements in their import permit and on their actual import documentation for those loads that states 5630. Well, they've been bringing it in fine forever. Well, there's one particular port, primarily in Houston, where a Customs and Border Patrol official has started enforcing the 71.1, and that has been causing some issues. So I know we sent a note out to all of our subscribers clarifying what the USDA requirements are, even though that's not part of our purview for what we're monitoring when we go into the mills, because we're monitoring you for 5630.
Super interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you for going through what TPI does and what
Absolutely.
customers and potential customers need to know. And now over to you, Robin, that travel all of Europe and maybe especially Northern Europe on a very regular basis, as I understand.
Yes, that's correct. I'm actually in Sweden in a hotel room as we speak.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask you, for a sawmill that wants to get certified, what's the initial qualification process?
Well, after we get the contract sent in and a deposit was paid, we'll usually do training of the mill, unless they already know how to grade the US lumber. After that, they will need to produce some qualification units that we will inspect, and we'll need to find less than 5% below grade, or so to say errors in their grading, for them to be qualified for that item and that grade. After that, well, we start coming on monthly inspections, and yeah.
Okay. And what happens during your routine monthly inspection?
We come in mostly we come in unannounced. So we just basically show up at the door, at the gates of the mill, and say, hi, we're here. Now we want to see what you have in your warehouse. We select usually a package of each dimension and each grade that they have in stock. Go through those, each piece, check them for conformance, such as knot size, wane, size, moisture content, all kinds of general defects. And during these inspections, we have to find less than 7.5% below grade per item. Now, if there is more than that, that means that we have to hold that lumber, and the mill has to regrade that lumber, regardless of where that lumber from that production batch is. It has happened that part of it's been in a port, or part of it's been in the US already, but that has to be solved in one shape or form, that lumber is regraded so that it conforms to the standards.
Wow, that sounds quite troublesome. So even timber that has left already needs to be sorted out and regraded somehow.
Correct. Either you can either ship it back, which I've heard some have done, or basically the grade mark has to be gone from pieces which do not conform. That is the main point of this.
Okay.
So,
Because as I understand, also the ALSC also does some sort of inspection. Is that correct?
yeah, they do. They are basically, see, this is a product certification program rather than a process certification program. So what they do, our job as the inspection agency, is to make sure that the mills conform, that they follow the rules and they conform. And ALSC, American Lumber Standard Committee, they're checking, are we doing our job right? do the mills conform? And what they do approximately yearly, but not quite. They have their own random selection process, which mills they want to inspect and when. But when they inspect the mill, they're actually inspecting us. Does the mill conform to the standards? So yeah, they're checking us during the inspection.
Okay,
And they
wow.
and they actually, let me add one thing, they actually want to see that are the findings of our inspections. You know, we make reports for each inspection we do, which is sent to the mill, and it's also in our in our database system, which ALSC will review. I believe they do it yearly. And they want to see that their findings when they go on a mill inspection similar to what our general findings are from over that year. And if they are, then we are on the same line, so to say. We're conforming.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And we'll be opening the Q&A in just a moment. But first, I would like to take a short opportunity to briefly introduce you to what Timber Exchange does, to what we do. What we do are three things: supply chain tools, a B2B marketplace, and a market data hub. And in our supply chain tools, it allows colleagues and counterparties to jointly manage the export sales and outbound logistics supply chain, with including legal obligations in a central place that automates all key processes and that actually complements ERP systems and a lot of the manual work that is actually done. And for example, you can automatically track progress on export sales, what is done, what is not done. We are integrated to chambers of commerce, container lines, courier vessels, bulk vessels, and couriers as well. And in our market data hub, actually, we publish a lot of interesting market data on production, inventory, loading, prices, and consumption of timber in key markets, from Chile to North America and all the way over to Japan, including the Middle East as well, actually. And we also do a lot of webinars and podcasts where we interview market leaders to discuss many different interesting topics, such as the one today. Some are about the market, some are about grading, and some are about how is ocean freight performing in general, for example. And now I would like to jump into the Q&A. So please submit any questions that you have. Down in the menu bar, you should be able to find a Q&A, a button which says Q&A, where you can submit your questions. And we already have one question that has been emailed to us. How quickly, and you partly answered this already, but how quickly can other countries be certified and start providing wood as a source? I mean that there is, despite all, after all, a lumber deficit in the US. From Russia, for instance, only one northern region is certified, but quality is as good as Sweden's anywhere. I think it's a bit.
Yeah. So the general question about how quickly could any new species and or region be approved, that generally takes from start to finish about a year and a half. Might cost in testing and everything somewhere in the $100,000 to $200,000 range. I mean, it just depends on how remote it is, where it is. I mean, these are just very ballpark figures. Plus, it also has to do with the timing of ALSC's quarterly meetings, right? So I mean, if you miss a submission deadline, that's going to knock you back 3 months because they meet once a quarter. Specific to the question about Russia or the reference to Russia, there won't be any new approvals that I know of for Russia because ALSC is not going into Russia to be able to monitor this or allow their inspectors to go in and do these annual visits or these semester visits or what they refer to those as. So the only possible way for something like that to exist or to happen would be if there was some type of Lacey Act audit. And we didn't talk much about Lacey Act today, but that's something to bring up too. The Lacey Act in the US is actually gotten a lot more attention just over the last 2 years on wood products. There are some cases out there in the industry where folks have gotten in trouble for illegal harvesting or anything illegal about the manufacture or procurement of any wood fiber would be a violation of the Lacey Act in the United States. So there is a way that you can audit or consult on any company's ability to have we'll call it a Lacey Act proof method or Lacey Act safe method of confirming their sources. It's very in-depth because it requires you to be able to show where that particular pack of lumber all the way back through the chain of custody of events to where you had a harvesting permit for that. And then the levels of risk go up when you get into areas of political unrest. And that just makes it difficult. So that's a long story short to say that I'd be surprised if anybody was able to, I have yet to see it, to where anybody was able to make a viable chain of custody system to where you could bring wood fiber out of Russia, whether it's into a neighboring country like Finland or put it on a boat and bring it over to the US and then grade stamp it there. Nobody's been able to put together a viable chain of custody yet that would satisfy ALSC to where they know for sure that this was from that particular region in Russia, whatever it is. And remember, there's only the one species approved in that one region in the Archangel. So I'm sure there's lots of good wood fiber in Russia, I would imagine. It's just not approved and been tested. And it's all the design values that are approved today had to go through this process or a similar process.
And actually, the questions are starting to pour in. I'll take the first one. How much does it cost to get a grade stamp for a sawmill in a designed value approved region?
Yeah, I'll answer. Oh, David, go ahead.
Yeah, Robin, I was going to say this would be a good one for you.
So our monthly fee is $750 per month, plus a part of the travel expenses, which are incurred from traveling to that area. There are other fees as well. For instance, if the mill is not conforming, then we start charging per hour fee for extra services or for consulting services. But the basic thing is $750 per month plus a part of the travel expenses to go there. Now, and after you start, if a mill is producing shipping more than approximately 3,100 cubic meters, that's 2 million board foot. That's the threshold for when you start paying a fee per board foot as well. So it starts increasing after that.
And I'll point out to that or append onto the end of that these are just our fees. So we can only speak for timber products.
Here's another question. Is TP offering the service to develop design values for new species or growth areas?
We can facilitate that. little bit going back to what we talked about, how design values get established. The testing has to be done on a representative sample from whatever the defined region is going to be. Most of the defined regions in Europe over the years have been generated on a political boundary, the geographic boundary of the country. But again, there are, for instance, areas in Germany that are only these particular states, or that exclude certain areas because those areas weren't part of the test when the test was performed originally. So the process is, once the a region or a new species, somebody comes forward and says, yes, I want to spend the time and the money to get this evaluated and approved, assuming it's a viable species, right? We would start off with developing the plan, and the plan would be submitted to ALSC that says, okay, here's a map. This is where we're saying the region is. On this map, these are the locations that are going to be sampled, because this is why we're saying this is representative. Then that would get approved, or once that gets approved, if ALSC approves it, then we would go out and actually sample those. We would gather those, 8,000 some odd pieces, or whatever the tallies were that I came up with. And we would have those tested. We have actually brought some of those over to our testing facility in Georgia and performed testing for companies that wanted new regions approved. Or if there's an accredited lab locally, we can always use the accredited lab to go in and witness the testing as well. Once those tests are approved, or completed, evaluated, and approved by ALSC, they will accept it, and then it gets published into a rules writing agency's rule book. So we can handle that all the way up to handing it off to somebody that is a rules writer. Oh, one thing I didn't discuss is why TP is not a rules writing agency. All of the rules that are out there today that are approved by ALSC are perfectly satisfactory for us to use. We're actually the only agency that's accredited to use all of the published design values that are out there under all the rules writers. So there's no need for us to go make somebody have to do their own additional duplicate testing just so we can publish our set of rules for this. So that's why we choose not to be a rules writing agency.
Thank you very much. And we have a new question, and there are a few questions left, but I assume there will be a few more before we close this session. The next question is, which companies in Russia are certified to provide certification by US standards grading?
Yeah, so
there are a list of certified companies.
There are none that I know of. Like I said, I don't know of anybody that is. The last time I checked, and this was probably just a few months ago, and talking with some of the other agencies out there, no one has ever gotten approved and issued grade stamps for lumber that's coming out of Russia.
So what is available in Russia is that it's one region that has divine values approved, but they don't have that. No mill in that area in Archangel has actually the grade stamp.
Correct. Because ALSC won't let their inspectors go into that area to monitor the mill, and therefore monitor what we're doing as an agency. So it's practically impossible to bring Russian material into the ALSC system.
Okay. The next question is, how much does an applicant need to pay before getting the grading stamps?
We charge a $5,000 deposit. And again, that is a deposit. So if you end your service with us and your account is paid in full, we give that $5,000 deposit back.
Okay. Any more questions?
Sounds silent.
Okay, here's one. Do you provide a service in Czech Republic, Poland, and Slovakia?
In Czech Republic, at the moment, we have clients that we inspect. None in Poland and in Slovakia at the moment. In fact, I do not believe there are design values made for Polish wood or Slovak wood for that matter. But that needs to be checked from the ALSC.
But is the service available for those
Yes,
countries?
of course, it would be available.
So to clarify that a little bit more, basically, wherever design values have been approved and the area is not on any kind of political watch, for instance, Ukraine and Russia are listed on the U.S. State Department website as being no travel zones. All right, and that's typically what ALSC uses as their guidelines as to whether or not they will allow their inspectors to go in there. So assuming it's an area that we can travel and there are design values published, then yeah, we could go in there tomorrow and start working with folks, training them to see if they can produce the conforming products so they can get qualified.
And to be clear, you help with the whole process. You can help with both the design values and then with the actual certification of the lumber itself, helping
We
customers
can.
with the whole process, if need
We
be.
can. I will say that that establishing the design values is not something we do. It's really not something anybody does on a day-to-day basis. That's a big project and it's kind of one-offs. Anybody that's gone through that can tell you it's a lot of work. Our main day-to-day focus is providing the auditing service to the subscribing sawmills where the design values are already published.
Okay. And here's questions are just pouring in now. You answered this again. Or previously, how long does it take to certify a new area for design values? It was around 1.5 years, you said, right?
Around 1.5 years, yeah.
Okay.
Sounds like there's a lot of interest around that.
David, if you want, we can actually do a poll where we can let the attendees vote. So if you have a question in mind, just let me know.
I got you. Yeah, I don't have anything right off the top of my head.
Next question. Is there any special applications where 2x4, 2x6, 2x8 lumber can be used but not graded? Can be used, not graded.
Mhm.
I've heard that there are some shed structures or small garden houses which can be built from uncertified, ungraded timber.
All right, so our building codes that we talked about in the US, so we have these international building code and international residential code, and it doesn't mean that every state uses the exact same version of that. Or some states, for instance, this came up early in 2021, some states like North Carolina have their own set of building codes that they write. They might be loosely based on the IRC or the IBC, but it's their own code at the end of the day. So it's every state has to have their own particular building codes. And then even within that state, because if you look at the US, you look at Maine up high in the north, it's going to have a different climate, different building environment than you're going to have down in Florida. You're building to protect yourself from different things in Maine than you are from Florida when you get to some extremes. Like you don't have to worry about snow load in Florida, but you do up in Maine. So that's why the different states might have their own regulations. And within the state, counties might have their own regulations. And then the cities within those counties might have special regulations as well. Dade County is a very famous county down in South Florida that's known for having very strict building code requirements, and because they have so many hurricanes that come through. Los Angeles out west is known for having very strict very strict building code requirements because they have so much seismic activity due to the San Andreas Fault that runs through that, or east of them over there. So I bring that up to say that I can't give a blanket answer that says you can go build a shed anywhere in the US and not use grade stamp lumber. I do know anecdotally that most areas, if it's not a residential, commercial, or industrial application, For instance, if you wanted to build a shed or a farm style building, the building codes usually do not oversee that. Therefore, there are no rules governing that. The reason you would grade stamp dimension lumber is for acceptance in the US for these building codes. That's the primary reason that you're doing that.
And I can contribute one small fact about that, because I do market analysis and presentations or outlooks every now and then, at least once or twice per year. And this one presentation, I believe it was in St. Petersburg 2 or 3 years ago, probably 3 years ago. I was touching on how the US market may affect the Middle East market. And what I found there, according to my research, is that around 55%, 45 to 55% of all US lumber consumption is actually going to new housing. And that's why it's a very important metric to track.
Oh, absolutely.
So there might be a market for uncertified 2x4s, but it's probably not very large.
I think that's an accurate statement.
We have a new question, quite similar. Is there any grade stamp outside of number 2 that can be used for lumber that does not come from designed value checked regions?
I don't know if I quite understood that. If I think they might have been asking, can you use other grades for building? And prescriptively, you can use, I think, stud grade in just about every prescriptive application or higher. And there will be limits to those, right? So for a certain wind zone, the height of that stud might be capped at a certain max height. If you're in a lesser wind zone, you might could build it a little taller. When it comes to floor joists and ceiling joist applications, the length of the span is limited based on the grade and the weight being applied, and other factors too. But so it really depends on the application. But yes, lower grades can be used. We've seen that most mills in Europe are primarily interested in producing for the US market either a number 2 product, a stud or standard product, which are lower grades. And some of them want to produce a higher visual grade, a number 1, or even a higher MSR grade, because the MSR grades, generally speaking, are going to have higher design values for most of the MSR that's produced out there than your typical visually graded number 2.
We have some questions left. Do you have a few more minutes?
Sure.
Yes, I'm okay if the audience, as long as they're willing to hang out.
So please submit your final questions before we round off this super interesting webinar. The next question is, how many European countries have Douglas fir design values approved?
My understanding is only France. Is that right, Robin?
No, I actually just checked. So the countries that are approved for it is France, Germany, Austria, and Czech Republic. I saw that message there and just checked it. So, and there were some restrictions for the other ones, for the Austrian and Czech, like not for all sizes. But yes, mainly it's from France and Germany.
So if you go to ALSC's website, alsc.org, and go to their lumber tab, they've got a hyperlink that says foreign lumber species, and will give you a comprehensive list. You can look it up by species or by country.
Thank you very much. The next question is, how much exactly is the testing for grade stamp, not the monthly fee, but the initial inspection and testing fee?
There's not an exact, I mean, it's expensive. I'd ballpark it, somewhere, let's just say around $150,000 to do all the traveling and collecting and testing and analyzing and submittals and report generating. That's what costs the money. And the testing is probably the actual physical breaking the material, probably the most expensive part of that.
I'd like to add something. I believe that the person who asked this was probably asking about how much it costs to get certified by Timber Product inspection.
Oh, okay. So not a new,
Now that I read that.
this is just a new mill, right?
Yeah.
Is that what we're saying?
That's what I
Grade
did.
stamp, not design value.
Okay, so that's your $5,000 deposit. The training, we provide at $750 a day for however many days your graders need training. And essentially, like Robin mentioned, since it's a product driven qualification, if you know how to grade already and you can demonstrate through qualification units that will come in and check that you can produce this product 95% conforming or better, then you're qualified. That's how that works. And the grade is width and grade specific. I'm sorry, the qualification is width and grade specific. So you would qualify, for instance, for 2x4 number 2, but you would also qualify separately for 2x6 number 2. It's not an additional cost to do that, but before I tell you that you can use this number 2 stamp on a 2x6, only because you've shown me that you can do 2x4, I've got to see that initial qualification for the 2x6 as well. And then later, let's say, hey, you call me up and say, I want to start grading 2x8s. Well, you're going to have to prove to me that you can grade 2x8s and put them on grade, because the different widths, especially for a human grader, are harder. I won't even say harder. The different widths are, you grade them differently because the knots generally show up differently in a 2x4 than they do in a 2x8. And if you take a 2x8 and rip a 2x8 into 2x4s, you've now created that beast of the ripped 2x4 that we treat as a separate qualification as well, because you're now taking that long spike knot that used to go just halfway on a 2x8, and it might go all the way through the 2x4. So it requires a little bit more oversight to make sure that it's on grade as well. We would treat a ripped 2x4 as a separate qualification than a non-ripped 2x4.
The next question, are there any possibility to ship lumber from Russia in order to carry the inspection per batch of shipment on US territory? And are there any agencies or trading distribution companies in the US that can provide the basis to carry such inspections?
So when the market gets hot, I get that question about once a week. And, you know, I've been with TP now 25 years. I have yet to see anybody accomplish this. And what it would require to accomplish this is to have a good enough chain of custody system that would tie each finished pack of lumber that's going to be grade stamped back all the way for every step in the chain of custody to the original harvest permit that would have been issued by the Russian government, basically. And that's an expensive thing to do, is to set that up. And it's a hard thing to track. And no one yet has been able to do that. And that's why nobody's issued grade stamps for any Russian wood fiber.
So in theory, it is possible, but it is expensive.
In theory, yes. Yes. We basically would say, look, you need to get Lacey Act conformance auditing in place, because the Lacey Act, to be able to be audited under the Lacey Act, you're going to have to be able to show all the way back to where you had it harvested on every load that you process, basically.
Okay. And the final question for today, are there states or regions from which no wood may be exported to the US? You touched on this already in some ways.
I don't know of any states specific or regions where you can't bring lumber that's been graded and stamped under the ALSC system in. All right. The two hot issues within the last year most recently have been Houston, the port in Houston, where that Customs and Border Patrol officials started enforcing the 71.1 centigrade requirement for phytosanitation. And then prior to that, not California, North Carolina, there was a city called Carolina Beach in North Carolina where the building code official raised some questions about whether or not anything outside of the 4 original primary species groups would apply. And those 4 original ones they were referring to are southern yellow pine, Doug fir, SPF, which comes out of Canada, and hemfir, I think. So those were the 4 basics. So then once you get outside of that, which I mean, goodness, we have what, 15 different species and regions or more approved over in Europe. They didn't have anything in their manuals in the North Carolina building codes that referenced anything about any lumber coming from Europe. Now, the lumber had been being used for, gosh, 25 years at least coming in. Nobody's had any problems. Houses aren't falling down. But he asked the question, well, how do I know I can use this European lumber in this application and sign off on it as a building code official? And so it required a lot of work that went on behind the scenes between us, some other grading agencies. There was essentially, let's say, a consortium of mills, European mills, that got together, formed an unofficial group that spent a lot of time working with us, and also the American Wood Council, AWC, to get the North Carolina standards up to par to where everything was now recognized for European lumber, and not just European lumber. There were many species, domestic species, that were affected by that too. So at that time, North Carolina was probably on everybody's radar to say, oh, don't ship to North Carolina. But I think we're past that hurdle at this point.
I have two small questions actually of my own. What about spruce bark beetle affected lumber or from Europe? And what about also blue stained lumber? Can those be,
so
if they conform to a 2x4, can they be exported to the US?
yes, in your number 2, stain is not a limiting grade restriction. So it can be as blue as you want, unless your customer is unhappy with it. I know some folks have jokingly talked about coining it and trying to trademark it as denim wood, or pre-stained wood or something like that for the blue stain. As far as the holes themselves, the grade rules do have a restriction for holes, and they've got a restriction for insect holes. So it's grade specific, width specific, but there is a way to evaluate it, see if it conforms.
Okay, and my final question is, what about, for example, Euro spruce 1x3, 1x4, or interior paneling? Does that need to be certified, or that can just be produced from anywhere and exported?
Yeah, great question. So there is one state in the US that I know of that requires 1-inch material to be grade stamped, and that's New Jersey. None of the other states, and that's a sales thing that the politicians came up with years ago, I think. None of the other states have any requirements that I know of that requires non-structural material. And most 1x4s that we're talking about are going to be non-structural, just appearance grades. They don't require anything to be grade stamped. Now, that being said, there are a lot of consumers in the US that would want to receive 1-inch material, and they're going to use it in an ISPM 15 application. So ISPM 15, that's the heat treatment of wood packaging. So they're wanting to build pallets, crates, use it for dunnage, anything along those lines. That falls under the purview of the American Lumber Standard Committee. So for it to be allowed as HT for consumption in a WPM pallet factory, let's say in the United States, it needed to be stamped with an HT stamp, an agency logo HT stamp. So, it might say TP, mill number 123, and then HT. A lot of the European mills actually choose to stamp it KDHT, and that's allowable too. So no reference to grade, no reference to species, but it still has the other 3 components of a grade stamp, which are agency, mill number, and moisture content, or HT reference. So very important to make sure that that's stamped that way, because when it gets here, if it does not have an agency HT stamp, it cannot be used. ALSC will not allow the agencies to let those WPM manufacturers to use it in an HT capacity.
And for our Russian friends that maybe can't export grade certified timber, 2 and better, 2x4s, etc., would they be able to export this product as an alternative?
No, because it still does not allow ALSC to go in and monitor that heat treatment. We have many subscriber locations that don't use grade stamps at all. They only have us come in to monitor their dry kilns. And that's important for them because if it's only a sawmill and a dry kiln, but they don't have a planer, so they're not going to dress it or anything like that, they want to be able to take that material and sell it maybe to, maybe it's a subsidiary location that's related to the same company, but their planer is, 10 miles away in another city. Well, both of those operations need to be monitored by ALSC, therefore monitored by the grading agency. So we would go into the dry kiln facility and all we're doing is checking the heat treatment records at those dry kilns. Then we set up QC procedures that allow it to be moved over to this secondary facility. And it could be a whole different company where we would monitor the grading of that material. Well, the grade, whoever's putting a grade stamp on it over there is probably going to want to be able to market KDHT. So we're going to monitor those heat treatment records from one to the other. If you can't do that, if you can't monitor and verify the heat treatment of this material, there is an alternative. It can be stamped with an S dry stamp instead of a KD stamp. So it just means that stamp means that it's dry, but it's not saying how it was dried and it's not saying that it was phytosanitized.
Okay, super interesting. Gentlemen, thank you so much truly for your time today and sharing all your very, very extensive knowledge. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure the audience does too.
Well, very happy to participate and hope we help answer some questions out there.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you very much for coming. And I'd like to notify all the attendees actually on our next upcoming webinar that is already next week on the 26th, where we will be speaking to one of the leaders of who analyzes global ocean freight. So we'll be looking at the key timber ports globally and the key timber trade flows, which carriers and which ports are the best or worst performing, the congestions, the blank sailings, and the dwell times. Because as you know, for some markets, you only get paid after the timber arrives. So of course you need to use a reliable port and a reliable carrier. And the difference, we have this data actually on timber.exchange in our market data hub under a tool called the Container Line Analytics Performance. So you can filter by route that you want to ship to and then see which shipping line is the most reliable in a ranking format. And of course, it's better to use one which will not delay your cargo and keep it stored in some port. So thank you very, very much, everyone, for attending today's webinar. Here are the two websites of ourselves and TPI, and we hope to see you all very soon again. And thank you again very, very much, David and Robin. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Amir.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Likewise. Bye-bye.